the upcoming expiration of the ESSER funding cycle in 2024. So we were able to leverage effectively the remaining balances in grants, including ESSER, to reduce our operating expenses. Once again, I emphasize in full compliance with the guidelines of the grants. Our total utilities expense was lower. I had mentioned this at prior meetings that there was a downward trend, and we think this occurred because we had a generally warm winter last year. We also had multiple energy efficiency upgrades that are beginning to result in outcomes, positive outcomes reflected in lower expenses, and energy conservation probably contributed as well. And our legal services fund was again at a relatively low level in terms of overall cost in relation to the amount that we have to set aside at the beginning of the year in order to have sufficient funding for not only legal services, but legal settlements and other legal matters that may arise during the year. So those are just four factors, and we were very pleased with that outcome for last year. Now, in food and nutrition services, I mentioned at prior meetings that food and nutrition services operates similar to a business on a profit and loss basis, and they are generating surplus funds which are utilized for food and nutrition. And so the end of year remainder was approximately $3.9 million. Of that amount, $2.4 million belongs to the Board of Education. Now I'm going to explain why. So this $2.4 million consists of two parts. It is the contribution for the food and nutrition retirees and a workers' compensation supplement. So first, let's focus on the retiree component.
Once again, everyone who's still here, thank you for coming and staying and volunteering time. We appreciate it. Very nice. We appreciate everyone's time and effort. Once again, these students and staff who are hearing this message, like to stop and grab a hot dog or salt and pepper for the road, please do so now. Closing up in a couple minutes. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Siegel, can you back up maybe bullet point to 2, please?
To which point, Ms. Skalvik?
The explanation, start an explanation of the 2.4 million.
Very good. So the 2.4 million belongs to the Board of Education, and it has two components. The contribution from food and nutrition that occurs annually at the end of year close for the food and nutrition retirees for the health insurance, and a workers' compensation supplement. So first, I'll focus on the retirees. This is the annual contribution from food and nutrition to the Board of Education Internal Service Fund for the cost of health insurance for their retirees. And at the start of each fiscal year, the Board of Education is required to add operating funds to the Internal Service Fund. It comes from the 850 account in the operating budget. And this happens every year, and it pertains to amounts that are calculated by the city based on actuarial calculations. And so in July, which is the first month of the fiscal year, we are contributing from our budget to the ISF for all Board of Ed retirees, including food and nutrition. At the end of the year, the food and nutrition budget reimburses the board for that annual contribution that was made from our budget at the start of the fiscal year for all of the retirees. So that's the equivalent of a reimbursement. And that is approximately about $1 million. Now, the total for this year is 2.4. So what accounts for the balance of 1.4? Well, we have viewed an actuarial report that was shared with us by the city. And this is a report on workers' compensation expenses that may be incurred over a 15 to 20-year period based on expenses that may appear later due to worker injuries that occur today or at any point in the future. So it's a projection based on actuarial calculations and was done for the entire city. And it includes, of course, the Board of Education. Now, they don't separate the board in this report, but it refers to all employees on the city payroll, and our employees do receive city checks. And so we are responsible for any future excess charges for workers' comp beyond the annual contributions from the food and nutrition budget in accordance with those projections, if those projections materialize. They may or may not. And so we looked at that number and looked at the percentage that would theoretically belong to the board, and then looked at the percentage that would be associated with food and nutrition, and was able to add $1.4 million. So we have $2.4 million of the 3.9 going into our ISF. So that is also good news. Now, the balance, approximately 1.5 million, is restricted to food and nutrition. And in terms of why is there a surplus, number one, they're operating with a high level of effectiveness and efficiency. So it's very important to understand that they're operating using business practice principles and they're achieving efficiency. Number two, they did receive a supplemental grant for supply chain issues from the, it comes from federal funding, but of course it comes through the state. And that was around $500,000. And there were some supply chain issues, as I've indicated in my notes, and there may have been positions that either could not be filled or were filled later than expected due to labor issues. And so there are some surplus funds. So those funds are labeled in our records as food and nutrition reserves. We've added them to the reserves on deposit from the prior year, and those funds may be used only for food and nutrition in full compliance with the regulations governing use of federal and state resources for food service programs, and we will strictly enforce this restriction. So we track the funding in a separate table and make withdrawals as required to meet food and nutrition needs. Now, last year, 22-23, you'll recall that I reported that from the remaining funds that were deposited at the end of 21-22, we brought back $2 million in order to fund the purchase of new equipment. So in 22-23, they received brand new equipment for the schools and brand new equipment in the nutrition center. Now, I'm not stating that every piece of equipment was replaced, but they spent $2 million on renovating and replacing outmoded and outdated equipment, and in some cases equipment that could not be repaired. So the funds were used to benefit food and nutrition last year, and there's still a balance. Now, looking ahead to the current fiscal year 23-24, I reported previously that they needed to purchase a new vehicle. Now, the cost of new vehicles has increased, and the vehicle that they needed was priced at $174,394. And we paid a deposit of $110,000 in 22-23. That left a balance of $64,395. And that balance will be paid in 23-24 upon completion of the vehicle and delivery. And so we expect that we may have to transfer funds in that amount from the Food Nutrition ISF back into the budget if necessary. Or we may be able to use current year funds first. Now, we may also be transferring some funds back to accommodate any orders that were closed last year due to delivery delays and reopened in 23-24. At the present time, they have not indicated to me that they're having any issues in terms of processing orders and fulfilling them. And so at this point, we have not requested the return of any funds, but we may be requesting the return as we move through 23-24 in order to accommodate those needs, specifically any orders that may have been closed and reopened. Now, as we look ahead over a 3 to 5 year time frame, there could come a point at which the escalated costs of operating are not fully covered by increases at the federal level in the per capita reimbursements. That may or may not happen. I'm simply indicating that it's a possibility. And so having the reserve account will be helpful. In addition, looking ahead over a 5 to 10 year period, it is likely that there will be a need for replacement of additional items of equipment, or after 10 years, perhaps the items that were recently purchased. And so it is very beneficial to have these funds available. All right. So at this point, I would be ready to move on. I know you may have some questions, but I would be ready to move on to the budget gap plan. And to reiterate my opening statement, the amounts that I have discussed in regard to the end of year close are incorporated in the gap plan. So you're going to see those numbers again, and they'll be in tabular format. So we'll go through those numbers step by step in the gap plan shortly. Thank you.
Great presentation as always. Any questions, Ms. Perez?
Who did you call on?
I'm sorry, I started with you, but I was looking at Ms. Perez. Now she has a question. Now you, Ms. Perez, please.
There's only just one thing. If Ms. Siegel, you could I'm just curious to see what the legal fees were in settlements, but I don't think it's appropriate to know that publicly. But if you could send that to us, just so we can have an idea of what that number looks like.
Yes, we have a workbook with all of the legal charges identified, so we can certainly share that. I will send the workbook to the superintendent's office, and the superintendent would authorize the sharing through the portal.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
No further questions.
Ms. Brown?
No questions.
Yes, Ms. Siegel, I have just one question or piece of information maybe for the public. I brought this up before prior. What would happen to the food and nutrition budget surpluses if, say, 10 to 20% of more children ordered food and ate meals?
Could you please repeat the question? I couldn't hear some of the words.
Yeah, no worries. If more children order meals, like 10%, say you get a 10% increase in children ordering meals, would that shrink the surplus or raise the surplus?
Well, every year we expect that the federal government will increase the per capita reimbursements for meals.
So it would operate on a per meal profit basis, so the more children eat, the more funds we get.
Yes, and if children do not have meals for whatever reason, then we're serving fewer meals and we are collecting less revenue.
So our children can help their school's budget by eating their food.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. That's something I just wanted to point out.
And it's a highly nutritious meal.
Very good. Thank you. You may continue with the next portion, please, Ms. Siegel.
Thank you. I just need a moment in order to bring up the next document. All right, I believe you should be able to see the document now.
Yes. And we got this one on our iPad, so I don't need to make it bigger, but maybe somebody in public might.
Larger? Okay.
Yeah, I got it on my screen, so it's not that big of a deal, but maybe somebody watching online can't see. I guess they could just ask you anyway. All right, thank you. That's fine.
Very good. This is the 23-24 budget gap plan, which was shared in the portal. Now, the monetary need is 25.5 million. You may recall that the original number in the projected monetary need in January of 23 was 26.5. Now, I have been able to reduce it because the utility expense was lower. Now, we're first going to examine revenue. And we had reported previously that the Alliance ECS addition for this year, which is under state revenue, is 3,264,563. Now, you'll also recall from our prior meeting that the total Alliance allocation, inclusive of the diversity grant, which is titled Increasing Educator Diversity. All right, I'm just using diversity for simplicity, was 3,496,917. So we had expected to receive, as I reported previously, about 3.5 million. That is what we received. However, 7% of the year-over-year increase in Alliance ECS was diverted in accordance with the state law to the Increasing Educator Diversity grant. So that grant has $232,354, and that grant has very specific guidelines. Now I'm going to move on because I have to cover a number of items that pertain to the gap, but we can always come back if you'd like to discuss the diversity grant in greater depth. But I would say that we are awaiting further information from the state in regard to what to expect for 24-25. And so should we expect that 7% of the Alliance ECS increase in 24-25 will again be diverted to the grant, or will it be a lower percentage? And that is a very critical question. We're trying to seek an answer, because any funds diverted from the Alliance ECS allocation reduce the funds available for operating expenses. But at the moment, we're going to move on to the analysis for 23-24. The city revenue was 2.5 million. And I previously shared the information that we had available at the time for federal and state grants. At this point, the numbers in the federal and state grants are not helping us. In fact, we have lost money. I don't have any information on the special education IDEA grant yet. We're anticipating that it's will increase slightly as it does each year, which is barely enough to cover the escalated costs. But you can see, as I mentioned previously, that Title I declined and the non-public school students increased by about 200. And so the amount due to the non-public schools increased. So in effect, in Title I, we have over 400,000 less. So that is a disappointment. What should we expect for next year? It would be difficult to predict at this time, particularly in light of the discussions that will be underway at the federal level in regard to federal appropriations. Right, but Title IIA was also down by over 120,000. Title IVA about 37,000, and the state priority grant minimally by about 2,700. Right. Now, I had also mentioned previously in the spring and in August, special ed excess cost, that the legislation passed last year increased the total state appropriation by 25 million. So that's for the entire state. Now, this may or may not benefit us. We won't know until mid-year. It would only benefit us if the cap on the local share percentage after we pay 4.5 times the NCEP is reduced for an out-of-district placement. And whether or not we benefit would also be dependent upon the number of students and cost factors statewide. Now, if there is an increase, we're going to apply it first to offset the growth in special ed expenses. I've mentioned in the past, there has been growth in speech services, in occupational therapy, and in one-to-one paras. So last year, you'll recall that the number of out-of-district students declined, and that is a positive direction and a wonderful outcome. In terms of the fiscal impact, the total cost actually increased by about $1 million because our excess cost grant declined. And why did it decline? Because our NCEP increased due to the infusion of the ESSER funds, and the cap increased to 25.36%. So that's a quick review in regard to the excess cost grant. We expect to apply Title I revenue despite the loss, because we did roll money. We always try to roll money within the guidelines into the new year so that if there is a loss in funding, we can absorb it without having to make any changes in staffing. And that's one of the factors. The other factor is to cover the escalated cost of the positions in the grant, and to have a small reserve in the event of an emergent need. And then we still have the ESSER grant in the third year. It will end in 2024. So we will use another $3 million in accordance with the guidelines to offset allowable expenses. The next item I've mentioned in the past, it has been included in every GAP plan, and it pertains primarily to the savings that are derived when positions are unfortunately not filled by certified teachers in the case of teacher vacancies, or paras in the case of para vacancies. This is a situation that happens naturally. We certainly want our positions to be filled, However, the reality has been over the last several years, including the COVID years, that there have been vacancies. And so there are savings that are derived. So it's positive on the fiscal side. There could be some, it could be viewed negatively in regard to, the services, but we make every effort to ensure that substitute services are delivered effectively so that positive outcomes can occur. And in order to balance, the initial projected withdrawal from the funds on deposit in the ISF would be about 12 million. And as we move into the next section, I'll have more to say about that projected withdrawal. I'm optimistic that the actual number will be lower. And then, of course, we note that we're going to continue to utilize grant funds, including ESSER in the final year, to the maximum extent possible, wherever appropriate and permissible to do so, in accordance with guidelines to fund services in our plan. And by utilizing the sound fiscal management practice, we will responsibly conserve limited resources in the operating budget. So now we're going to move to the table that summarizes the ISF actions. So at the start of the year, we had a grand total of approximately $28 million. Now that included the pre-fiscal year 19 surplus of about $2 million, plus the pandemic savings. In 22-23, we withdrew initially $5 million. However, we were able to balance with a lower number, the 1774380, and so we returned $3,225,620. Right, so we withdrew 5 and we returned $3.2 million. From food and nutrition, we added 2.4. Food and nutrition had a total balance of 3.9 million. 2.4 belongs to the Board of Ed. 1.5 million approximately is the balance. We will probably use 64,395, as I mentioned earlier, to pay for the vehicle. And the balance is 1,449,551. So I'm deducting, in effect, their balance in the area that I'm circling so that I can get to a bottom line for the Board of Education. Okay. So basically, we started with 28, we withdrew 5, we returned 3.2, we've added 2.4, and our new balance is 28,673,041. Now, there was also an internal surplus of $6.4 million approximately. So last year there was a surplus of an internal surplus of about $3 million. And at that time, the question was, well, why does that happen? How did it happen? And it was the first time that it happened in my experience. It also occurred on the city side in their ISF, I was told. And we think that most likely it was due to lower expenses for the retirees, maybe due to more retirees retiring with a higher premium cost share based on the union contracts, as well as perhaps lower workers' comp expenses in the current year. Because the Internal Service Fund, you'll recall, is the conduit or the depository for the funds that the city uses to pay for health insurance and workers' compensation. That is the purpose of the internal service fund. So last year there was an internal surplus of 6.4. So we were glad to see it. It certainly is beneficial. What will happen in 24-25? We don't know. There may be another internal surplus or not. I'm not anticipating a shortfall, but we will monitor it throughout the year and engage the fiscal trends. But for 22-23 end of year close, the grand total is now $35 million. I indicated that in order to balance initially, we're looking at a projection of 12 million. Now, that doesn't mean we're withdrawing 12 million tomorrow. It just means we may need up to that amount. And if we did need that amount, then we would have a balance of 22.8. Now, there are two very important points to keep in mind. First, there should be at least 2.4 million on reserve in the event of a shortfall in the ISF in the future and or to offset those future workers' comp claims that could occur. And we don't know when they might occur. I mean, they could occur 6 years from now or 10 years from now or not occur at all. Actuarial projections are not always perfect. And so we have to keep in mind that we want to always try not to utilize all of the funds. The second important point to keep in mind is the one that I keep emphasizing, which is that we're taking every possible step in the current year, 23-24, to conserve operating resources and maximize the use of our grants. I mentioned earlier the ARP ESSER pre-K grant. So we do have information that indicates that we have that grant again. And so that will help us in terms of conserving resources. That's one example. So I'm optimistic that we will not have to withdraw 12. This is an initial projection. Hopefully it will be somewhere between 6 and 12 or maybe even lower. It will depend on many variables, including the exact cost of various types of services, including special education and expenses in other areas. But let's work through this hypothetical scenario, and with approximately 23 million available, what will happen in 24-25? Well, I have mentioned previously that for 24-25, our projection of monetary need will be higher than the need in the current year, will be higher than the 25.5 million. And it will be significantly higher. Why? Because the monetary need for next year will consist of, I have it in this box. The monetary need for next year will consist of the escalated costs, and that includes salaries based on collective bargaining agreements, health insurance, MRF, which is the contribution to the retirement fund for non-certified staff, transportation, and utilities. However, I think utilities will stay relatively stable. We'll experience an increase this year, but the rates will stay relatively stable based upon the work that was done at the city level to lock in certain rates. But there will nevertheless be escalated costs in all the other areas. And then we need to add on the required amount to close 22-23 and 23-24 in balance. What did we need to close from the ISF and grants? And And then we have mandated services in ESSER that will have to be funded by district resources. And I had reported previously that the estimate at the time was around $7 million to cover the special ed positions, the English language learner positions, specifically ESL teachers, the contracted special ed services, and various other services that arose from the pandemic and therefore were funded in ESSER, but without a reduction in need, those services have to be brought into the operating budget. So these are the three primary factors. Now, if we should receive in revenue for next year, let's say 10 to 11 million, then we may, with the projected balance, which I hope will be higher, we may have sufficient funds to close the 24-25 gap. So that is good news. And, you know, a year ago or even 6 months ago, this is an outcome that no one could have predicted, and we certainly did not expect. And so I'm very pleased that we are at this point. However, 25-26 now appears to be uncertain in terms of having sufficient revenue. Right, and the final item in this chart would be the reconciliation of the Food and Nutrition Services ISF. And you can see very briefly that at the end of 21-22, they had approximately $5.1 million, and we withdrew $2 million, and then they had a surplus of 3.9. By the way, in this chart, a red entry means a positive number. That means they have the funding. And then 2.4 million was transferred to the Board of Education, as mentioned, for the retiree health insurance and the workers' comp supplement. So they now have a balance of approximately $4.6 million, as discussed previously. So with that, I will conclude, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Siegel. Let's start with Ms. Baptiste Burns this time.
No questions.
Ms. Burns. Ms. Brown?
No questions.
I got one question, a couple of questions actually, just real short ones. The 110,000 deposit on the truck, is that a usual deposit? It seems very large.
Which number?
I don't know. It was with the truck purchases way back in the beginning.
Am I scrolling to the right place?
It's food and nutrition purchase for a truck.
Oh, the vehicle cost was approximately $174,000.
Do we have that in our possession, or we're waiting for it to be built?
It's being constructed. They went out for bid through city purchasing. It's a commodity, right. So they had requested city purchasing to issue a request for bid. Then the bidders were reviewed in accordance with the rules of city purchasing and the city ordinance, and they selected the vendor. But the construction of the truck requires multiple months.
Correct. I'm just wondering if, like, because I put a 20% down payment in my house, and I take out loans, cars, and stuff. It's like 10-15%. I'm just wondering if this is like a very large percentage of the purchase price. It's like probably like 60 to 70% purchase price. And just right away, I think, what if this company goes out of business before it's built? We're out that deposit. I'm just wondering if that's like standard deposit, or we pay it as we go, or.
I would not have any further information. I know they received an invoice for the amount of the deposit. They were told that that was the amount that would be required. Presumably, the supplier has to purchase materials in order to build the vehicle. So I would not have any more information. I don't know if that's standard across all suppliers or not.
It was just a curiosity. It's a slight concern. I don't think there's any much need to dig further. Now,
I mean, we have every confidence that the vehicle will be constructed as
yeah, that's not.
as requested and delivered.
It's a large number for a deposit. That's all. Next question is when do projected expenses go into this presentation for the 23-24 school years? The reason I'm asking is because when we talk about position control, procurement, we recently approved two RFPs, which possibly cost $100,000 each, and like 3 or 4 extra positions. That would those be included in this, or would they be included when the contracts are signed?
Yes, well, first in regard to positions, we are leveraging our grant funds. My presentation today pertains to the operating budget, which integrates with grants so that we can balance the operating budget. Right?
Correct.
There may be a new position that was created that in 23-24 is in the ESSER grant. Right? So it would not be within the 25.5 million monetary need or within the operating budget, but it would be solely in the ESSER grant. There could be another position that is split funded. Right?
Different, I'm sorry, it's not really addressing my question. Let me try it in a different way. Other expenses entered and accounted for when they're encumbered, when they're incurred, what? Because a lot of the expenses I'm speaking of are just projected, and the positions have not been filled yet, and contracts have not been signed yet.
Yes. So let me speak first to the RFPs. So if we reach the point where a vendor is selected as a result of the RFP and the board decides to go forward with a contract and actually utilize that contract, then there would be an order form prepared in order to encumber funds. Now, I'm aware, obviously, that the RFP was approved for issuance and that there could be a future expense. So I look at the available funds and I set aside an appropriate amount pending a final determination. Right. So within any budget plan, there have to be some reserves. Obviously, there are limits. When a new position is created, there has to be funding for that position. And so we look to create that position in the most cost-efficient manner. And depending on the purpose of that position and the specific responsibilities, we may be able to leverage our grant resources to fund it either wholly or partially.
All right, so it seems like there's a reserve within the budget for unaccounted for expenses that may arise in the future. So this number, so say all these expenses come to $1 million, the bottom line of this budget is not going to be lessened by $1 million.
Well, if we let's suppose we had hypothetically a reserve account of $100,000 and we needed 150, we'd have to look to another account to find surplus funds in order to increase the $100,000 to 150.
Right, and that's what it's basically getting at, because it could shift depending upon how much we expend that was not accounted for in the initial.
Yes, but there are limits, obviously.
Of course. Okay, thank you. That answers my question. And I think, just as far as, with the ESSER funded services, we spoke of positions we're gonna have to keep, and we're just speaking of the mandated services, correct?
Yeah, well, I'm referring primarily to 12 special ed teacher positions that were funded and are still funded in ESSER grants. These are primarily resource teacher positions that arose out of the pandemic. In other words, in the first year of the pandemic, we had to add 8 resource teachers. We had to create 4 new special ed kindergarten classes. So the need arose from the pandemic. At this time, meaning today, as of today, that need still exists. During the course of this year, perhaps the need will decline, but currently we have to account for the expectation of incorporating those 12 positions into our operating budget next year when we no longer have ESSER funds. We also have actually 10 English language learner positions. One is a native language support position. So there's 22 teacher positions that have to be brought into operating resources. And I had also mentioned the occupational therapists. We had to add 3 positions. We have contracted speech services and psychology services. So, and there are certain administrative positions that, some administrative positions were designed as temporary and will end. There are others that represented a legitimate need, and that need may still exist.
Absolutely. Do you have an order of magnitude of the cost of all the positions that would have to be absorbed into the?
Oh, it's around $7 million.
So $7 million more dollars will be added to our ask for operating costs.
Yep.
When its funds are exhausted. And we didn't even mention I don't want to say unnecessary, unmandated services such as the 45 paras and maybe some of the psychologists and social workers that are mandated. Those are still considered to be maybe on a chopping block when ESSER funding runs out?
At this point, I'm working in terms of the 24-25 analysis. At this phase of the analysis, I'm working on maintaining the core operating program and funding the mandated services. And so at this point, meaning as of today, based upon what we know today, we would no longer have the funding for the additional social workers and guidance counselors. The easy teacher positions would end. The teacher leader model, does not currently today have a fund source. We are continuing our search for grant opportunities to try to continue services or provide alternate services, perhaps even more effective services. So my emphasis to you this evening is I'm speaking only about the current status, right? Which it could change, but we have to plan in a responsible manner.
Absolutely, I absolutely agree. Right. The reason I raise that up is because we will definitely, if we keep the positions, they got to be paid for. In order for them to be paid for, we need more revenue, and in order to get more revenue, we've got to definitely advocate for it and get it. We just need that. I just like to keep that in the forefront. So
exactly, and I had mentioned previously through the efforts of the grants office. We work together to apply for a federal grant through the state senator's office. So when when that type of grant is awarded, it takes 2 years for the money to arrive and to be available. And so the timing is actually perfect for us. So we do expect in 24, 25 to have access to that grant. And that should enable us, pending confirmation, to hopefully fund 2 guidance counselors and 2 social workers for 1 year. So it's still not a recurring fund source. It doesn't provide ongoing revenue, but it's a start toward providing an extension for 1 year for a minimal number of additional positions.
Thank you, Ms. Siegel. I see Ms. Baptiste Perez got a hand up again. You got another question again?
Just a quick, Marlene, the grant you just mentioned, we've received it, and so we're just waiting for 2 years to actually get the funds?
We were told that it has been awarded. However, it takes time at the federal level for the appropriation to actually be finalized. I believe Nadira is on the line. Nadira, could you explain that? Thank you.
Yes, correct. It is allocated. It's in the federal budget. We just have a notification that it will be received. We received an award. It's out of the congressional spending bill. So we received one of those last cycle. And so we got notification relatively early. However, it takes some time after it goes through the appropriation process. It needs to be delegated to a federal agency, in our case, Department of Ed. And then there is a reapplication process and an award notification process. So that sounds like it all should happen very quickly. It does not. It does take a couple of months. At this point, we do have the original notification we got maybe about 7 to 8 weeks ago. We're expecting to, get more information about the application process and go through that and hopefully have the notice of award relatively quickly. We do have 2 years usually to spend that money. Again, it's not ongoing, but we do continue to search for additional grant opportunities so that we are bridging, when something is ending and when something is continuing. But we do have to abide by the federal, rules of going through the application process, and that's what we'll have to do for this particular fund source.
Okay, and then my last follow-up question is in terms of staffing. Are we hiring additional grant writers with experience to help us become competitive? And maybe this is twofold, as well as associating with universities to gain additional credibility when applying for grants of various different levels. I know with facilities, our partnership with UConn helped us secure a grant recently. I don't recall the name, but it was in part because of the partnership with UConn, but also in terms of actually staffing. So we have grant writers, professional that has experience in securing large grants for the district.
Yes, so the superintendent asked us to work on creating to start a position, and we may be creating 2, but we're doing it in sequence. But we would create a position. We're Nadira is in the process of writing the job description, but this is contingent upon the position being self-sustaining. In other words, the individual who is hired ultimately after posting and a selection process would have very specific responsibilities, obviously as outlined in the job posting, but specific responsibilities to research grant opportunities, write those grants, and be successful in securing grants. Now, the grants usually would allow us to take indirect costs. It doesn't apply to every grant, but most federal grants allow for indirect cost. And so, and there's an indirect cost rate, which is calculated every year. There's a state process that we have to go through in order to validate a rate. But it's usually between approximately 4% and 5%. And so the indirect cost that's generated would be applied to the salary of that individual. So we want to do this on a self-sustaining basis. Now, there is another grant that we received through a federal grant through the state senator's office, which has been reported to you previously, and that is the library renewal grant. So, and I know Melissa Jenkins has mentioned this when she has reported on the funding used in the ESSER grant toward library renewal. So we spent last year $1 million on library renewal from ESSER, and now we have approximately 1.9 million in this federal grant that we knew about last year, but we couldn't spend last year because the funding had to go through the federal cycle for approval of the appropriation. So we've now reached the point where it will become available, and she'll be working, of course, in consultation with the superintendent on a plan to present for library renewal. Now, I said about 1.9. The actual grant is about 2 million, but we're going to take off the indirect cost, and we're going to use that indirect cost to fund the position initially until it becomes self-sustaining. If we were to hire someone in a grant writing role, and that individual were not successful in securing new grants, the position would not produce the desired results, evidently. And so there's no point in having a position that doesn't produce the desired outcome. So we have to have accountability, and we would do everything possible to support this individual under Nadira's leadership in the grants office to hopefully be successful. Did I answer all parts of your question?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. That was a great question and a great answer, because I love the way the position is going to be funded. It's cost neutral, all upside. Yeah, it sounds great. If anybody else has any questions, we can speak now.
Mr. Nikolovic, I believe you have to take a vote on the budget gap plan so that it can be presented to the full board.
Yes.
For final approval. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Siegel. I apologize for that. Yes. Motion to push to full board approval of the budget gap plan for 23-24 school year. Thank you. Yeah. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Motion carries, and it'll be on the next agenda. Let me just make sure Ms. Brown is aware of it. Thank you very much. Now let's take a motion to adjourn. Motion to adjourn. Second.
Thank you. Good night.
All in favor? Good night. Thank you very much, Ms. Siegel. Everybody have a great night. Stay home safe.